Hello watch enthusiasts and welcome to Watch Chronicler. In today's episode of Watch Chronicler Unscripted, which is incidentally also available as a podcast on Spotify and SoundCloud, as well as by RSS feed if you look at the link down below or on the article, I'd like to speak about Rolex. And Rolex is a brand which has inevitably been in the press enormously in recent months because of these ever-increasing prices for pieces like the Daytona or the Submariner, or the GMT Master 2 of course. But today I'd like to put a different spin on it, because last week there was the incident involving Horology House, which has been quite widely publicised and discussed as the general gist, and if you want a proper sort of explanation of the story, then do go to watchchronicler.com to read our full article. But to give you a rough idea of what took place, many of you will know the YouTube channel Horology House, and for the fantastic content which actually it produced, including, rather ironically, content on how to spot a fake Rolex. But the long and short of it is that Chris, the fellow who used to run Horology House, it seems the YouTube channel and all social media has been deleted, was found to have been selling fake Rolexes. And this has left rather a bad taste in the mouth regarding the world of Rolexes, and it's raised the point, actually, as to whether these highly elevated prices for Rolex is having a more sinister, or rather are having a more sinister effect on the watch industry and Rolex in general than we realised, apart from them simply costing too much for a lot of people to be able to afford. And so today in this podcast, as well as video if you're watching this on YouTube, I would like to address this point. I'd like to talk about how Rolex prices have increased and where they've come from in terms of where they originally stood with pricing, where they are now, and what we can expect for the future, as well as how one might look at this in a wider sense when looking at the industry and looking at how to enjoy watches safely in general. This week's episode is sponsored by Horology, the maker of unique timepieces with their own in-house movement, truly made for those who relish detail, innovation and real-world value. But before I begin, do head over to our Instagram page to be able to catch all the latest in terms of new releases, but also in terms of announcements for podcasts, videos and articles. And speaking of articles, do head over to our website to be able to catch all of the most interesting articles from the last few days about all sorts of subjects, whether it's new releases, incidents like the one which happened to Horology House, or some more in-depth articles like a history of the Seamaster 200 Shom from Omega. Now, whilst I'd like to speak about modern Rolex, I think it's important to start in the 1950s, because this was the time when so many of the most desirable models we see today were originally produced. Now, in the mid-50s, a Rolex Submariner, which is perhaps the most recognisable watch ever made, cost $150. And it was more expensive than some other options on the market, don't get me wrong. So a lot of lesser brand names were still more affordable, and that's something not to be ignored. However, these were still watches which were a lot more accessible. Certainly they were within the monthly salary of the standard man in period. Nowadays a Rolex, certainly for a Submariner for example, wouldn't fit into a conventional, comfortable monthly salary. So it does show a change there, but what's most interesting to look at is the rate of inflation by comparison to the prices demanded by Rolex for these watches. Because if one looks at the period pre-1984 or so, and pre-1984 and 1985, we see that prices increased quite steadily, at a faster rate than inflation, it has to be said, but not at a disproportionate rate. By contrast, by the 1980s, when one sees the modern Rolexes coming out, the sapphire crystal models with glossy dials, applied white gold markers, and versions of watches like the Rolex Daytona, for instance, which just after that point inherited a new movement from the Zenith El Primero and a whole new look, Rolex repositioned themselves. They recognised that they weren't going to be an everyman's watch anymore. They were going to be purely the status symbol which some of their models commanded, the position rather which some of their models commanded as these status symbols. And so they repositioned themselves with more polished edges and a different look. Now, from that period onwards, there's pretty steady increase in prices. Even if one compares it to inflation at that point, even through times of peak inflation, the average Rolex will be 6 times less expensive if it had simply followed inflation and remained the same price as it was in the 50s when it was first released. So that's something to consider. But by the mid-2000s, Rolex had developed this image, and also they were at the forefront with new technologies and pieces to really impress people, like ceramic bezels, for example. But from what I can establish, it feels like the last 10 years where Rolex prices have been concerned have been the perfect storm, really, for enormously high prices and an enormous desirability for these pieces. Because at the end of the 2000s, or the noughties rather, one saw a period of financial instability, but also a time which coincided with the creation of watch blogs, giving a sort of new lifestyle side to watches, which hadn't been seen before, and this gave an appreciation for the history of watches, for releases, the importance of new technologies, and inevitably Rolex received an enormous amount of recognition for this, and rightly so for their achievements through the eras prior. But this mix of people looking for investment pieces or looking to put their money into something which they could wear and enjoy, in addition to this new recognition, did develop the foundation for the desire people now have. And certainly the auction world, which has seen this increase in interest in watches in general, as people look to these analog ways of enjoying time, has enormously contributed to the popularity of models like the Rolex Daytona or the Submariner, by putting forth these stories of what they achieved in period. And a lot of brands achieved similar things, but never quite developed the same appreciation from buyers in general that Rolex did. And of course Rolex is a brand which is run with the most business-like of approaches. And this is something which has been kept from Hans Wilsdorf himself, the founder of Rolex and Tudor, in terms of approaching watches from a very pragmatic perspective. These are watches to be sold. It's not a piece of art, it's a business. One aspect which is rather interesting about these Rolex lines of watches which are particularly popular is the fact that it tends to be their larger watches which are the most popular now. If one looks across their range, the only exception really being the Deep Sea, although even these are sold out in the vast majority of boutiques. But if one looks at the most popular models, the GMT Master 2, the Submariner, the Sea Dweller, and of course the Daytona, as well, interestingly, as that Sky Dweller, one does see that it's watches all over 40mm which do the best. In many ways, the least desirable Rolexes are the Oyster Perpetuals, which are, alongside being the most affordable of the Oysters, also watches which are very simple and tend to be much smaller sizes, whether it's 39mm or 36. So this does show one side to this craze and this fascination with these particular models. But irrespective of how one looks at this trend, the reality is that these watches are selling for these prices, and so one does have to consider the implications for the industry in general. But now for a word from our sponsor. The sponsor of this piece is Horology, a brand which started with its own movement and created a brand around it. After 3 generations, their K1 automatic movement offers a groundbreaking silicon escapement, 65-hour power reserve, and cost-level reliability that puts it on the map as a truly tested movement. Today K1 resides within their sister firm, THE Plus, a company that is pushing the boundaries and setting new standards in modern horology development. By taking an industrial approach to movement design, Horology have created a movement capable of meeting a broad spectrum of production demands, with unprecedented efficiency of production too. The result is a movement which not only offers modern componentry, but also modern design in a world of movements finding their roots in the 20th century. Modular by design, this movement additionally offers a large date, small seconds and power reserve built into the architecture, thus avoiding the stacking of cumbersome additions. Despite its feature set, the K1 fits into smaller cases and retains a slender form factor. In truth, this is the movement which I see as a real contender for the best of the current flock of luxury automatic movements. To learn more about Horology and the K1, head over to horology.com. Now, there is a whiff of tulip mania, which was a period between 1636 and 37 in primarily the Netherlands, where tulip bulbs were enormously expensive, selling, if I remember correctly, for the price of ships, even warships, were comparable prices to some bulbs during this time. But ultimately, speculation caused a market collapse, and tulips returned to a perfectly sensible and reasonable price to be expected for their value to society in terms of what they offered. But we see a similar thing with these Rolexes, where if you were to look elsewhere, whether you look at other brands or even other variants from Rolex themselves, there are often more inherently valuable pieces offered for much, much less. And of course, this is the nature of supply and demand. The reality is that watches are all about feeling special, about enjoying what you own and what you enjoy wearing, and so being given specifications, being told this watch is technically better than another and is less expensive, doesn't really have the influence it would, say, in the car world. But what I think is interesting is that it is changing the way we look at watches, and also the security which we have when we buy them. Because in the past, if you bought a Rolex from an authorised dealer, whilst there are frustrations at any point, and there certainly were in the past, it was a secure process. You were inevitably getting the genuine article, even if the seller decided to play the game of not giving you the warranty card until a few months in order to prevent you from selling it immediately. You still did have the knowledge that you were getting a product of authentic quality and of origin. The difference now, of course, is the fact that because these watches have reached such an enormous value, with, for example, a Rolex Daytona reaching almost £30,000 in some cases at certain points, they are inevitably being taken advantage of as items to make money on, and large amounts of it. So we're seeing these watches resold by sellers, and inevitably one doesn't know what the origins of the watches are in certain cases, or where this particular seller has been able to get hold of watches. And this is what ultimately stung people with the whole Horology House incident, which is a shame, and I feel very sympathetic for those who suffered as a result of this. But the fact is that by creating this market where it's controlled not by Rolex themselves, but by third-party dealers, one is opening oneself up to a number of scams and the risk of scams, as well as fakes. Because inevitably, as the genuine article becomes more expensive, the fakes are going to become better. But one aspect which the whole Horology House incident has shown us is that, as a matter of odds, it's inevitable that sometimes a trusted seller, or at least what one assumes is a trusted, reputable seller, will do something which is inherently wrong, and will not treat customers in the way one would expect. And ignoring the case which took place last week, one does see resellers of Rolexes, big and small, and I won't name anyone in this piece, but big and small are regularly found in positions not selling fakes, but simply not servicing watches properly, or having less than perfect sales setups, and all these things which you simply wouldn't get in a market where the brand new product from Rolex was more expensive than the resale, simply because of condition, which would be the more natural way for it to work, and is usually the way for most other brands. But what this says about the industry is an interesting thing, because inevitably this is going to have to come to an end eventually. There's no way that Rolex prices for these steel models can keep on increasing, just because it'll leave standard customers of the brand with nowhere really to go in terms of buying a watch. Ultimately, these watches will reach a price where fewer and fewer people can actually afford to buy them, and it'll also leave a position where, just as these few people can buy them, at some point they're no longer going to be the desirable product, at which point one has these enormously heavily priced watches with no market. So it has to come to an end eventually. For me, though, the moral of this whole situation is the fact that one simply has to buy what one enjoys, and that fun in a watch doesn't always equal the most valuable or indeed the most desirable watch. After all, Rolex Daytonas back in their day, in the 70s for example, were ignored and discounted as undesirable Rolexes, and yet now they're worth an inordinate amount of money. So it's always difficult to predict these things, and especially if one's in the habit of buying watches as an investment, I think that one has to be very, very careful, whether it's to be careful of fakes or scams, or just to be careful of a market turn. One has to buy what one enjoys. And if you happen to enjoy Rolex Daytonas, then if you're comfortable with the risks, then by all means enjoy the Rolexes that are out there. But I think it's important that no one feels they have to be part of a community of watch buyers of a certain product if it simply isn't the time for it. I'll conclude this podcast and video there, but I'd be fascinated to know what you think of this whole Rolex phenomenon, how it's changed the industry, but also what you think of these scams and the situation which has taken place over the past few days. So do leave your comments on YouTube, as well as on the Watch Chronicler website down below this if you're listening to the podcast there. So thank you very much for listening and watching. This is Armand from WatchChronicler.com. Out.